So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second of our Bellwether lectures. For those who don't know me, my name is Helen Margetts, and I'm the director of the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, safe in the knowledge that I can't do worse, I think, than the person who introduced me at an event on Monday, sitting next to me with a photograph in front of them, and introduced me as Henry Margetts. I'm going to try to do better. I'll just say a quick word about this flagship series of lectures, which features 2 lectures a term by eminent speakers. We've called it the Bellwether series because we're looking for speakers who incorporate the spirit of the modern bellwether to create or influence trends and to predict future events. For those of you who don't know, as I mentioned at our first lecture, a bellwether is actually a castrated ram who goes with a bell around their neck with a flock of sheep to attract a flock of sheep to follow them. Of course, neither of those analogies would apply either to our speaker or to our audience, of course. What we're looking for, and what we've certainly found in tonight's speaker, is people whose knowledge and creative instincts extend beyond the borders of their academic disciplines and reach out beyond them. So Professor Rob Kitchin is a Professor of Human Geography and Director of the National Institute of Regional and Spatial Analysis at the National University of Maynooth in Ireland. His work has really, he really is world famous, and it's been recognised across the world, most recently by the award of the Royal Irish Academy Gold Medal for Social Sciences, which was presented to him by the Taoiseach Enda Kenny. That's the highest award an academic can receive in Ireland and recognises Rob's major research contribution into how to make cities smarter, the subject of the lecture tonight. Another major achievement is the award of a European Research Council Advanced Investigator Award on the programmable city, which is enabling him to form a large research team and really investigate, really get under the relationship between cities, software, and big data. Rob has written some really kind of sort of game-changing books. One of these, the latest one, The Data Revolution, is published by Sage, coming out later this year. Previous works include Code Space, subtitled Software and Everyday Life, in which he and his co-author examine software from a spatial perspective. And Key Thinkers on Space and Place, co-authored with Phil Hubbard, a comprehensive guide to the life and work of key thinkers covering ideas from humanism, Marxism, globalization, deconstruction, and feminism. He was also the author with Martin Dodge of the Atlas of Cyberspace and Mapping Cyberspace, which I'm sure lots of you were familiar with, which were really trailblazing in terms of bringing bringing geographers together with people who study the internet for an ongoing dialogue. Other publications are rather surprising. One of them is Stiffed, subtitled Friends Help You Move, True Friends Help You Move Bodies, in which the protagonist wakes up next to a corpse, and The Rule Book, in which D.S. Cole McEvoy hunts a serial killer in the Wicklow Mountains. It really is extraordinary to me that, as well as being a director of a national institute and an academic, Rob also manages to write successful crime fiction. And if you're interested in that or the many book reviews or short stories that he writes, you should look at his blog site, The View from the Blue House. So Rob's going to talk to us tonight about the concept of smart cities, cities composed and monitored by pervasive and ubiquitous computing. And I think in Rob we really have the best possible kind of native guide to help us explore that new technological landscape. We're really happy to have you here tonight. Thank you.
great. Thanks for the introduction. It's kind of set me up to fall flat on my face. You've probably got a massive expectation now. So what I want to talk about is this notion of the real-time city and whether we're moving towards this notion of being able to kind of know and control, manage cities in a real-time way. And it, as introduced, it's building on a series of kind of works, mostly with Martin Dodge, but with other people. And what I'm interested in is this notion of smart urbanism that seems to be developing. There's a lot of kind of discourse and talk about how we're going to move into this new era of smart cities and so on. And really, just to give a kind of a brief overview of where I'm coming from in relation to the literature around this. In my view, there are kind of two main schools around smart urbanism. The first really focuses on the notion of the city being instrumented, and it's things like the city being composed of everywhere, which is pervasive ubiquitous computing embedded into the fabric of cities, into the infrastructure with the sensor networks and various bits of software and so on that are producing big data that allow us to kind of collect data about the city and manage the city in new ways. And the second is a set of policy literatures which is really kind of building out of a kind of spatial planning, city regional planning, and so on. That's about the entrepreneurial city, the competitive city, the creative city, and smart cities is the next kind of phase in that. But it's a kind of a set of policy instruments that are about creating a city that allows innovation and growth and development and so on. And it isn't just necessarily about ICT, but ICT is a part of that. So it's a kind of a wider vision of a smarter society, smarter cities. So obviously things like human capital, creativity, education, sustainability, there's all kinds of these kind of buzzwords linked in amongst that. Both of those visions, I think, are underpinned by the development of ICT, and they're embedded into city fabric, and also kind of neoliberal visions of how we reimagine the city as this kind of competitive, entrepreneurial, sustainable, productive, market-led forms of technocratic forms of governance and of living and so on. But what I'm going to do in the most of the talk is talk about the first one, this kind of instrumented city, rather than the second one. And this instrumented view is really building off of my interest in this notion of the intersection between code and the city, and the way in which software is becoming increasingly embedded into how cities are built and run and managed and so on, and how code is mediating the various practices of city life. So these are just a couple of quotes that kind of illustrate this kind of instrumented view. So Nigel Thrift and Asher Min, the modern city exists as a haze of software instructions. Nearly every urban practice is becoming mediated by code, and I'll try and illustrate that in a minute. And Mike Batty and colleagues arguing that the city is composed of constellations of instruments across many scales that are connected through multiple networks which provide continuous data regarding the movements of people and materials. Okay? And if you like, this kind of view is kind of additive together to create a smart city. So if you have extensive ICT networks, add that with ubiquitous, pervasive mobile computing, social located media, big data and data infrastructures, forever kinds of storage, so cloud storage, distributed storage, and so on. Algorithms and software enable forms of automated management. So this is forms of governance that act in automated and autonomous ways. You create a smart city. So these kind of things added together create a smart city. It's a very instrumentalist view, and it's the view that's very predominant, particularly in the technological computer science literature on the side of smart cities, as opposed to that kind of policy stuff that you find more within the kind of urban studies, social science literature. So to make the argument that we live in an increasingly coded world and that software is becoming increasingly layered into our everyday urban practices. This is a kind of a taxonomy that myself and Martin Dodge produced a long time ago now, I think probably a decade ago, about what we thought was kind of going on. So we were kind of arguing that the nature of kind of objects is kind of shifting, and we increasingly get objects that are machine readable. Typical machine readable one would be a barcode that you scan and so on, or it could be your magnetic strip, or it could be your chip and pin, or it could be whatever. But there are things like codecs. So these are objects that have code in them, but the code isn't actually essential for them to work. So I don't know, digital clock on an oven. The clock serves a purpose, but if the clock breaks, the oven still works. Sorry, that'd be a coded object. A code object would be when the code is essential to the object working. If the code breaks, the object stops working. And a logobject would be an object that remembers the history of its own use. So your smartphone, if you have an iPhone or whatever you've got, this records the history of its own use. So it's a different kind of object to objects we would have had previously, okay? And it can communicate that history to third parties and so on, okay? We obviously live in a world with various kinds of coded infrastructure, whether that's communication, entertainment networks, utility, transport, logistics, financial networks, security, policing networks, and so on. Even systems that we think of as being relatively dumb, like a water network where you turn on the tap and the water comes out. Nearly all of those have a control room somewhere, a whole bunch of sensors across it to measure water quality, pressure, flow, throughput, and so on. That's not a dumb system anymore. It might seem to you when you're turning the tap, but that's a coded infrastructure. There's a whole series of coded processes in terms of transaction of flow of digital data across the infrastructure, and in relation to things like finance, taxation, insurance, health, crime, utilities, service usage, and so on. These are increasingly reliant on information management systems to work and to operate. And these together create coded assemblages. So the classic example of a coded assemblage would be the airport. An airport basically doesn't work without software. Everywhere from when you buy your ticket, you can't buy a ticket with cash, or you can buy a ticket with cash, but you would still be recorded in the system. You would have to enter information into a system. You can't anonymously go through. There's an information system there that operates. When you check in, through when you go through security to when you go through immigration, the plane itself is full of lines of code to get it off the ground. These are not manual things any longer. And if any of those bits break down, the system shuts. If air traffic control goes down, no plane takes off. They don't try to go back to a manual system anymore. If checking goes down, nobody checks in. They don't do manual check-in any longer. You can only check in through the computer. Okay? It's a coded assemblage where lots of different pieces of digital technology and digital databases intersect to produce what is now the airport. Okay? And for us, we argued produced what we call code spaces. And the slash there is not us trying to be trendy. We were trying to say that these were didactic, that they couldn't be separated. If the code failed, then the space wasn't produced as intended. If the checkout till goes down in the supermarket, it's no longer a supermarket. It's a big warehouse. You can't buy anything manually. The person at the checkout till has not got a clue what the price of any of the products are. And they couldn't process the payments in any case. You'd mess up their customer relation system, you mess up their stock taking, you mess up their logistics chain, all kinds of stuff, right? Same with the check-in in the airport. It just becomes a waiting area. It's no longer a check-in. So the code and the space are didactic, interlinked. And of course, what they also do is they produce enormous amounts of new data about citizens, and what I want to argue as well is about cities. All of these kinds of objects, infrastructures, processes, and assemblages work on generating and processing data. And in that sense, they're a key element of the move into the era of big data. So this is the data revolution, in a sense. So on the one hand, we have the opening up of data and the open data movement and so on. On the other, we kind of have things like the data infrastructures, so whether they're research data infrastructures or public administration data infrastructures, and so on. And then we have kind of big data. And I want to make the case that big data consists of these elements that make it different to small data or previous periods of data. So these are my characteristics of what I think constitutes big data. The first three are very common in the literature. So they're huge in volume, and we're talking vast quantities of data, as I'll try and illustrate afterwards. They're very high in velocity, so they're in real time or in near real time. It's a continuous flow. These are not snapshots in time. These are constant flow of data. They're very diverse in variety, so they're both structured and unstructured. They seek to be exhaustive in scope, so they're not samples. They're seeking to be n equals or. They're seeking to be entire populations of or entire systems. They try to be as fine-grained as possible, so we're trying to go down to individuals or and so on, as opposed to aggregates. So we want to go as fine as we can in the resolution, and we want them to be indexical, which means that they're unique. We can uniquely identify them and pull out on that basis. Okay, so very fine-grained and indexical, and they're relational, so we can connect them together. So we have common fields across various different types of database, and we can interlink them across, so we can then build them up into other kinds of relations and look at the kind of relationships within those data sets and so on. And that they're within database systems and so on that are extensible. So you can add new fields in very quickly and easily, and they're scalable. So you can kind of scale the collection and storage of the data in relation to the flow. So if you suddenly go from 10 tweets a minute to 10 million tweets a minute, you can cope with that, right? You can scale very easily and so on. And what this does is it offers the potential for real-time analytics of massive, dynamic, varied, detailed, interrelated, and low-cost data. Now, I've had people kind of say to me, look, we've had big data for ages. You know, if you just think of the census, like the census is huge volume of data, right? Okay, but if we think of the census in relation to these things, yes, it has volume. It doesn't have velocity, right? It's once every 10 years. It takes 2 to 3 years to process before you get the results. It doesn't have variety. The census only has 30 to 40 questions on it. And they're very structured questions, and they don't really change. It is exhaustive, so it does try to capture the entire population. It does have resolution, but not as it's released to the public. So we get aggregates for nearly all of the data because of confidentiality and so on. It is relational. It doesn't have extensionality. Once you've set the census and you've set your 30 questions, once you've started to do it, you can't go back and add in new fields or change the questions or do anything else. It has to stay the same. It's an inflexible data collection tool in that sense, and the same with the outputs. So it doesn't have extensionality or scalability. So it doesn't qualify as big data under these conditions. And the reason why, to a large degree, is things like the velocity and so on. Okay, and velocity, I think, is one of the key changes. So if you think about the census coming once every 10 years, if you think about what Facebook is doing, it's processing 2.5 billion pieces of content, 2.7 million likes, 300 million uploads per day. Okay, Walmart is generating 2.5 petabytes of data to more than 1 million customer transactions every hour. And it's estimated that 1.7 million billion bytes of data per minute were being generated globally last year. So these are enormous volumes of very fast-flowing data that we're now being confronted with. They're very, very different to sampled small data. And traditionally, that's how we've known the city. We've known the city through sampled small data, lots and lots of small data studies going on all over the place, whether they're ethnographies or whether they're surveys or whether they're whatever they are. So this is a qualitatively different, I want to make the case this is a qualitatively different type of data. Okay? And in that sense, the smart cities technologies are kind of a key component of this data revolution, because there's a whole series of these technologies that are producing very large amounts of data that tell us things about what's going on in the city and the people who live in those cities. So we have things like directed surveillance. So I'm kind of categorizing them into three ways, these sources of big data and technologies in the city. So directed surveillance. So these are kind of digital CCTV, where you still have a human controller who can point the cameras, move the cameras, do things. There are things like spatial video. There are things like LiDAR scans and so on, where there's a human controller who's pointing and doing things and so on. The second would be things like automated data generation. So these are systems that, once programmed, collect the data kind of on their own in that sense. So they're automated, they're autonomous, they're automatic and so on. So forms of automated surveillance, so whether that's ANPR, number plate recognition that scans your license plate, pings it off to the DVLC, sees whether you've paid your congestion charge. If you haven't, then prints off the fine and sends it to you. No person's involved. Okay, it's an entirely automated system, checked against databases and so on. Same with things like automatic meter reading technologies and so on. There are capture systems, so these are systems that don't get you to self-survey. They actually capture your behaviour through your interaction with that system. So a checkout till worker used to be surveyed by a camera, where the manager might be looking to see whether they were doing their job properly. They're now monitored through the actual process of scanning the items and processing the payments. The system through which they do their work is the system by which they're surveyed. So their behaviour is captured within the system of their work. Okay, they're not externally surveyed in that sense. And if you work in a supermarket, if you go really, really slowly, then it will tell you to go faster, or it will call the supervisor or something. There's a bit of software there that's actually monitoring. I knew somebody who was basically, she was doing an ethnography trying to see how slowly she could do this and how she could disrupt the software in a supermarket in various different ways. Obviously, there's a plethora of different digital devices that we have, whether you have a smartphone and you're using your location-based services, or you're using Twitter or whatever you're using where you're going around the city that might be generating data about your movement and your location and all these kinds of stuff. Various kinds of sense data or scan data. So we might put a whole set of sensors around the city that might be collecting data about humidity or light or resistivity or acoustics or whatever it is that might be collecting data, and they might be sending that back, or scan data from credit card swipes or barcode swipes or whatever it is. Interaction and transactional data, so whether you're paying for things, whether you're click streaming through websites, whether you're doing online banking or whatever it is. All of those transactions have unique codes. They're all logged and monitored and so on. And then, of course, there's the Internet of Things and machine-to-machine communication. So increasingly now, we have objects that are connected to the Internet. They're doing their own work, like these sensors. They send stuff backwards and forwards. There's communication going on. Might be firmware going up and loaded and being updated, and all kinds of stuff happening. And there are now billions of objects connected to the Internet, all producing data and all communicating that data. And then, of course, we have volunteered data generation, which is us actually freely giving up our knowledge and our ideas and the actions that we do and so on. So whether that's social media and us doing Twitter and Facebook and putting down what our opinions are about different places or different aspects of the city, whatever it might be, or surveillance, where we might use something like Fitbit or is it Jawbone or any one of these kind of things that monitors our own health and our own behavior, and that data is shared with Nike or whoever has sold you the kit, and you can use it to kind of self-regulate your behavior, monitor your own behavior, and so on. There's the crowdsourcing, where people might contribute in their GPS trails into OpenStreetMap and so on, and citizen science, where, I don't know, you might be collecting information about the bird populations within your urban town, and you're contributing those into an RSPPB survey and so on. So you're actually trying to contribute into scientific project. So these are all sources of data, and they're all sources of data that are very large, very quick moving, highly varied. They're indexical, they have high resolution, they're extensible, they're flexible, and so on. Okay? And we tend to be also moving towards integrating these systems. So typically up until now we've had single systems operating, what we might call ellipticons, or so these are kind of views from particular positions as opposed to panopticons, an all-seeing eye. These are views from particular locations on particular things. So, you know, intelligent transport systems, all trying to pull together data about what's going on across a road network and so on. So you might see, I think in Britain they tend to be square, the transduction loops that you would see in the road. You might see like a bit of kind of black stuff on the road. They're transduction loops. As your car goes over the top of them, it pings off a message to a box that's often hidden in the bush on the side of the road, and it's basically counting cars so they know what the traffic flow rate is across the network and so on. Might be supplemented by surveillance cameras and so on, and it's pinging back the information off to some control room. This is a live feed of traffic accidents and where they are in Los Angeles and so on. Your car itself is a computer on wheels. There's typically about 40 computers in the average car. It's collecting all kinds of different bits of data about the conditions of the road, how you're driving, what the engine's doing, and so on and so forth. And often it's mediating the actual driving itself. You know, if you press the brake pedal, you're not actually pushing the blocks against the wheels. You're sending a signal to a control box who, taking account of the data around it, makes a decision of how it's going to press the brakes against the wheels. So it's a mediated through software process, and a lot of driving is like that now. You're not fully in control of the car. There's some software in between that's augmenting or mediating how your driving experience, what's happening with the car. And of course, you can plug it in when you take it to the garage. Now, often the person plugs it in and starts looking at the data as opposed to just tinkering with the engine. Okay, and this can be used for all kinds of stuff like checking your warranty. I'm sorry, Rob, but you were driving 80 miles an hour in second gear on the 2nd of August. Your warranty is not valid. Okay. I doubt my car would get to 80 miles an hour, even if it was in 5th gear. But now we're starting to see these kind of being pulled together. So rather than just having your traffic system, you start to pull all the elements of city management into one kind of system. So this is an example from Rio. This is their city control room, if you like. There's 180 people working there on a rotating shift of 60. So they flip over every 8 hours. So there's basically 60 analysts sat there looking at all the data flowing in from all the various systems across the city, whether that's weather feeds, or whether it's road feeds, or whether it's emergency stuff, or whether it's environmental stuff, landslides, flooding, weather, pollution, whatever it might be. They can link that in with the public administration data that they already have, like the census, like the records that the city government hold on taxation or land use or whatever it might be. And they're also crowdsourcing the data, so they're monitoring Twitter feeds, they're monitoring Facebook feeds, and so on, that tell them something's happened. You know, fastest way sometimes to find out that something has happened in the city is to monitor the Twitter. The Twitter will tell you there's been an accident or whatever. Okay, so they're monitoring those feeds to see what's going on. They've also given the staff tablets. So you're a city worker, you're the first person at an accident, you can get onto your tablet and you can find out whether an ambulance is already on the way, what estimated arrival time is, or you can start entering data back up to that system to say, there is an accident here, I need an ambulance, there are 2 people injured, blah, 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 right? So you're now using your city workers to crowdsource information about the city. Okay, so it's a two-way flow. They can get data, they can log onto here and pull down what data they need as a field agent, and they can push data back up the other way. Okay? But you're pulling together all the various different elements of the data held by the city. You can start to interlink those across. And you can start, and people are starting to play around with these things like city dashboards. So this is meant to be kind of like a real-time city dashboard for London. So it will tell you what's going on the tube, what's happening with buses, what's happening with weather, what's happening with whatever, you know. And again, it's also it's also telling you what's trending on Twitter and so on. This is another kind of indicator project, I think from Edmonton. I don't think it's real-time data, that one. This is Santander, where you can, you have your little city, you have a city app that will tell you about 2,700 places in the city, but it will also give you real-time data about car parking, about the weather, about road conditions, about how many bikes are in the bike share stands at different places in the city, and so on. So it's trying to use some of the information that's maybe collected in here and actually feed it back to citizens so they can use it to help with their behaviour in the city. And then, just before I go on to critique some of this stuff, I should put my hands up to say that I do it as well. Okay, so since 2005, I've been running the All Ireland Research Observatory, which is an open data site in Ireland, trying to pull together all the data from the north and the south, across all the different government departments, state agencies, and so on, and then feed it back to people through maps and through various types of visualization and so on. And obviously we're working with all these various agencies to try and get the data out of them and to share it. So one of our conditions of us working with them to sort out their data is if anything we do has to be open to everybody else. So that's how we've been trying to leverage open data there. And I'm now just starting to work with Dublin on their real-time city analytics dashboard stuff and so on. So we're just working on that, and also key indicators. I've also been working on European projects on this. So the last one I did was an SBON-funded project called Kitchin, which is key indicator for territorial cohesion and spatial planning. So if you're going to have indicators that go across nations to try and benchmark countries as to what's kind of happening, what would be sensible indicators and what data actually does exist that you can kind of harmonize and so on. So I'm interested in trying to do this. At the same time, I'm trying to critique what it is that I'm kind of involved in, and what these cities and so on are doing when they're trying to do this. Okay, so it's a kind of a critical GIS, kind of radical statistics kind of approach into this kind of stuff. Okay, and of course the promise of this stuff, these kinds of ideas, is it does make the city knowable and controllable in new ways. It provides real-time and joined-up information that's been lacking. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in this in Ireland, and we were talking about this before the start of the lecture, is in Ireland political decisions are made on anecdote, localism, and clientelism. Like, evidence is actually really useful. So we can talk about the politics of the evidence and the problematics about it, but it's probably better having it than not having it at all, and working through the problems of having it rather than leaving everything to people to kind of make decisions without any evidence, and to base it on anecdote, and to base it on favours, and to base it on whatever else they want to do that on. It might give improved models and simulation for future development, so we can then start to kind of simulate and predict how we might want the city to be in the future, and how we might get there, and what might happen doing that. And we have a lot more finer-grained data to be able to do this. We're not just basing our kind of population models on the census that's collected every 10 years. We can base it on lots of other data that we're getting from lots of other sources. There's a notion that it will kind of lead us to more efficient, more competitive, more productive service delivery by state agencies and so on. It will cut out a lot of the waste that we're always being told exists, and it will lead to better run cities, and it will be able to help us tackle particular issues more effectively. Okay, in terms of, I don't know, dealing with floods, or dealing with climate change adaptation, or creating more sustainable urban living, or whatever it might be. It'll also help create more transparency and accountability, because a lot of this data is actually about the actions of state agencies and government. So it will give us a handle on what these people are up to, how are they spending our money, are they spending it wisely, and so on. And of course, it provides better information to citizens. So citizens start to become much more informed about what happens in their city, and therefore they can participate on a more engaged level. And lastly, of course, it's seen as being stimulating creativity, innovation, and economic growth. Okay, so this is the kind of the sell that the sell that's given about why we want to create smart cities, and they're pretty compelling. I mean, what's interesting about a lot of the discourses around these kinds of things, of course, is they're often quite difficult to argue against. It's often quite difficult to say, I want to be less productive, I want to be less competitive, I want to be less transparent, I want to be less safe, less secure, less productive, less blah, 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 right? How can you argue against this? This is all perfectly logical. Okay. Right, I'm going to have a go at arguing against it. So what might be the perils of smart urbanism? Or what might be some of the key things that we need to think about and be aware of, and maybe counter in some instances? The first thing, of course, is that this data is not neutral and objective and value-free and so on. But like all data, it exists within the framework of the ideas, the techniques, the technologies, the context that conceive, produce, process, manage, analyze them, and so on. There's a politics to this data in terms of what's collected and what's not collected, what's done with the data, what's not done with the data, how it's used, how it's fed into policy, how it's omitted from certain things, and so on. You have to remember, a lot of this data is big data, is generally what's kind of easy to ensnare. It's often a byproduct of something else. Okay. It was never, often the data is being used to answer questions for which it was never collected. It was never intended to do that. So often it's kind of shoehorned or fitted in to try and make it do something else. The data is often quite messy and dirty and needs quite a lot of cleaning. It certainly needs a lot of understanding of the context of what the data is and how it's produced to maybe gain as much value out of it as you would want. So it can be full, of course, of occlusions and biases. Even just thinking about things like these indicators, and I've been thinking about these quite a bit in the last 2 or 3 weeks as we make a start on trying to look at some of these key performance indicators for Dublin as a city. Even just making decisions as to whether you're going to do your indicators as comparators. So we just want the data to be able to compare between different parts of the city or between different cities and so on. Or are we going to use them as benchmarks to benchmark things across? Or are we going to use them as targets? An indicator as a target where you say, we're going to reduce carbon emissions by 40% is a very different kind of indicator than just this is what's going on. You're now setting a political, that's a political decision that you're now holding the city to account to, the city authorities to account to. It's a very different kind of indicator. So even just how you set up your indicators, which indicators you pick, will make a big difference. Obviously, you're probably not going to conclude all of them. So if you're only going to do 5 economic indicators, which ones are you going to pick? Why are you picking those ones? Are they just being picked because they're the ones that's going to make the city look good? Or are they actually the best ones for transforming your city in terms of how you want it transformed? So the data are generated and employed within systems designed to enact particular political and policy visions. And we just need to be very mindful of this. And when we're looking at some of this stuff to kind of query and deconstruct what is kind of happening within them and why it might be happening and so on. The second is this promoting technocratic and algorithmic forms of governance? Is this assuming that all the aspects of our cities and our city life and so on can kind of be monitored and measured and disassembled into neatly defined technical problems, into neatly defined data that can kind of capture what's happening in the city and tell us what's going on? And can it be addressed by technological solutions? And a lot of the smart city technology is technological solutions to whatever it might be, traffic congestion, emergency response, whatever. Okay. And can these solutions go into other fields? I was talking to somebody earlier on. I get very worried when I hear about people talking about, apps for homeless people, and we could solve the homeless problem through a technological solution and so on. It's like, no, you can't. That's a deep-rooted structural problem of inequality and mental health and community issues and all kinds of stuff, right? And it ain't going to be solved with an app. Okay? So, and there's all kinds of elements of cities around, they're really complicated, complex systems that have culture, have personalities, have politics, have systems of governance, how capitalism works and so on. And yet we're creating these technological fixes for how the city is working and operating. And really what they're doing is kind of enabling more efficient management of the manifestations of problems rather than actually addressing the deep structural problems. Okay? And by turning to this kind of smart city will provide the solutions to climate change, adaptation, or creating resilient cities or creating sustainable cities. Is that really the fix, or is really the fix to think carefully about the kinds of societies we live in and changing our behaviours and changing the kinds of ways that we live our lives, and changing our modes of governance, changing our political economy, whatever it might be. Okay. The second is there's a kind of a corporatization of governance going on, a marketization where various kinds of companies are coming in and offering to fix the problems of the city for a fee. Okay, you can buy our technological solution, and we will sort out your city. And of course, the smart city agenda is being heavily promoted by a whole series of the world's kind of largest software and hardware companies, who clearly see city governance as a very long-term market. So your Siemens, your IBMs, your Intels, your Oracles, your SAPs, your whoever, they all have smart city programs and research programs and so on, and they're aggressively marketing their products and wares to cities to help them become more productive, more competitive, more sustainable, and so on. And of course, there's, my concerns around that are threefold, and I'm not the only. These are all drawing on the literature. They're not all just my ideas. I'm pulling these off of people like Anthony Townsend and Adam Greenfield and others. So first, that this is promoting a kind of a neoliberal political economy, the marketization of public services, and so on, that we're outsourcing all of this kinds of things, at the same time that these companies are seeking deregulation and privatization and so on of the means by which some of these things are regulated. The second is the potential for creating technological lock-ins or path dependencies that beholden cities to particular technological platforms or to particular corporate solutions. So what does it mean to give how you run a part of your city to a corporation, and then if you want to take it back, or you've now on a particular path dependency, it's very difficult to go back to an analog way of doing something. You've now outsourced all your expertise. You no longer have your expertise with inside the state services because you've got rid of it because you've marketized it. So very difficult to go backwards on some of this stuff. And what does it mean to have cities run by corporations for profit? Okay. So I think there's some kind of interesting questions that we need to think through there. That's not to say that all companies are acting in very predatory ways, but there are certainly some of them who see this as a very significant long-term market, and they see it over a very long term. You know, if you're providing city governance over a long period of time, that's probably a very lucrative, fairly secure contract. And the third is there's probably some issues around, you know, one-size-fits-all city-in-a-box solutions. The kind of deals as if all cities are kind of the same. that they all have the same kinds of governance structures, same kind of political economy, same kind of administrative structures, same attitudes to various kinds of things, and you then kind of have to, you have to kind of fit your city in around the software products that you're buying, and certainly one company has been marketing a product which is effectively a smart city in a box, and that would trouble me, given that we know that cities are incredibly diverse entities and are highly varied in how they in their kind of culture and the way they work and their societies and so on. Fourth is to what extent are we creating future problems for ourselves by taking two very complex open systems, cities and software, and interlinking them? Okay. Software is notoriously open and porous and provisional and open to failure. It's, everybody in this room is constantly having to put patches and updates and virus checkers and everything on their computers, right, to keep them safe and secure and so on. If you make your whole city fabric and your services dependent on software, to what extent are we actually creating buggy, brittle and hackable cities, and what will be the consequences for this? And and as these things become more and more interconnected and more interdependent, how are we going to cope with the challenges of producing stable and robust and secure devices and infrastructures? And these increase. Like, we have enough problems trying to keep our computers updated. All these Internet of Things all over the place, most of which are unsecure. You probably read in the newspapers recently the person's fridge who was hacked and became a spam server and sent out like 800,000 spam emails. Okay, and there's all kinds of examples of this. The Israeli electricity company says their system is attempted to be hacked 6,000 times a second. Okay, Israeli critical infrastructure is constantly under attack. Okay, and sometimes it works. So recently, Haifa, one of their cities, was gridlocked because the traffic management system was hacked. And they took out a couple of key traffic light intersections and they just gridlocked the city. Okay, so what does it mean when your critical infrastructure can be hacked, or all your records from your city can be stolen? And we're often, we've been reading recently about very large data security breaches going on and records being stolen and then being sold on and so on. So, these are real concerns about what does it mean when our city becomes very, very dependent on software, and yet at the same time, this stuff that's meant to be dealing with vulnerabilities, this stuff is designed to cope with vulnerabilities in other systems, is itself potentially a vulnerable system. Okay. So we're increasing the risk of critical failures and normal accidents. It's kind of a question. At the time when analog systems are disappearing, and the tacit knowledge that went along with those analog systems is also disappearing. Okay? So the other reason why you couldn't check in at the airport without doing the electronic version is because the person behind the desk couldn't do it in the analog way in any case. They've never been trained to do it in the analog way. They don't have that tacit knowledge. And the fifth one is the one that's often rolled out, which is the Big Brother scenario, the panoptic city, where there's massive amounts of data flowing around about citizens, about city services, and so on, and our digital footprints and our digital shadows. So the data trails that we leave ourselves, our footprints, the data other people collect about us, our shadows, are hugely increasing. And it's now possible, as we know from the NSA leaks and all the other kinds of stuff, that it's possible to track and trace individuals and their actions and interactions and transactions in minute detail across a number of different domains. And these data are not, it's not simply a concern around security and safety, but these data are going off into commodity markets and are being sold and are being used in all other kinds of ways to profile people, to socially sort them, to do forms of anticipatory governance. I don't know if any of you have seen the story about the Chicago PD, Police Department in the last couple of days, who've now implemented anticipatory governance, and they are now going to forgotten the phrase now, it's a pre-criminal. So they'll come and knock on your door and they'll say, our software has identified you as a potential future criminal, and we're telling you that we're keeping an eye on you. Okay? And they've done it off of social network analysis, and they've done it off of their characteristics of where they're living and so on. So this is Minority Report now happening, you know, going along to people and telling them, we think you are going to be a criminal, and we're telling you now, don't do it, because we're already onto you before you've done it. Okay? And obviously what we're doing is we're kind of integrating and binding these various different data streams together, and it is moving us from ellipticons to panopticons. So, you know, if you're in the NSA, I'm sure you know an enormous amount of information about people. If you work for a company like Axicom, I'm sure you could find out an enormous amount. In fact, I know you could find out an enormous amount about people. Axicom have claim to have about 1,500 data points. So these are individual variable fields, so like age, sex, height, weight, you know, consumption preferences or whatever. 1,500 data points, about 500 million people. Okay, so this is one of the large data consolidators in the US, right? And they're hoovering up data from all over the place. They've now just entered into a deal with Facebook, so they can now marry all your online stuff with all your offline stuff. But they did really powerful profiles about people, right? And clearly it raises all these kinds of spectras about Big Brother and all kinds of associated consequences. Okay, just to conclude. So the notion of smart cities has gained a lot of traction in recent years. It's really part of a stage, I think, in this kind of evolution from kind of competitive cities into creative cities into smart cities. It's part of this kind of neoliberal entrepreneurial revisiting of the city in a particular way. This is the new technological version of it as opposed to the creative talent, whatever version of it. And it's a way of conceiving the city in a particular way, of creating new markets, but also of dealing with particular problems about creating more sustainable, more efficient urban management and so on. And a key part of this vision is kind of instrumented cities, of city infrastructures and domains, and the production of data about those cities and about the citizens who live in it, and about all the various kinds of practices that happen in it, whether that's shopping or whether that's working or whether that's dwelling or whatever it is, right? It's about kind of knowing and understanding the city in that sense. And it does offer a range of benefits. If I was to skip back a few slides, I could have another go at reconvincing you that smart cities are a good idea, right? That it offers these various kinds of benefits of increased participation, increased knowledge, increased efficiency, productivity, competitiveness, and so on. But it also does raise a whole series of issues, whether that's, you know, like the kind of the politics and reification of data and of algorithms, whether it's technocratic governance, whether it's corporatization and further neoliberalization of city management, whether it's technological lock-ins or path dependencies or system vulnerabilities or surveillance and data valence and issues around profiling and social sorting and anticipatory governance and so on. And clearly, we're in a period where things are shifting really, really quickly. A lot of this technology is moving along, you know. 4 or 5 years ago, nobody was talking about big data. 10 years ago, nobody was really talking about social media, locative media, and so on. These things have only been around, 10 years or something, you know. This stuff is moving very, very quickly in terms of how they're being embedded and so on. And that's really outstripping our way, I think, as kind of critical social sciences of trying to make sense of what's happening and react back against that and to kind of say, maybe we need to think this through and think what the implications are. So we're always in a kind of a reactive rather than a proactive position. And I think we're always going to be in that position with this moving very, very quickly. But there's clearly, I think, very big implications that we do need to kind of reflect on. You know, so I think there is a pressing need to think about, you know, how cities are being translated into data and software and how these are reshaping urban life. I think we need to think a bit about the kind of the composition and function of urban analytics and control centres and so on. And I think we need to think through these kind of new forms of technocratic, corporatized, real-time forms of governance. And I'll end it there. Thanks.